Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. This week's show features the wild turkey. Not the drink, thank God, the actual bird. Wild turkeys were non-existent in Wisconsin 50 years ago. Today, they're abundant after a reintroduction effort by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and the National Wild Turkey Federation. It's a conservation success story that I've known very little about until recently. To learn more, I called National Wild Turkey Federation District Biologist Rick Horton. In addition to talking about the rebound of the wild turkey in Wisconsin, we also chatted about his organization's desire to get a new generation of people interested in hunting. Furthermore, I asked him about a local Madison curiosity, a group of turkeys that were known as the Atwood Avenue turkeys. Here's my chat with Rick, a native Wisconsinite who's now living in Minnesota, but travels through the region on behalf of the Federation. I guess the reason I wanted to talk to you was, I'm not really a hunter or anything, but, for most of my life, I hadn't seen a turkey in the wild, I don't think, until maybe I was in college, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And I think maybe over time, I noticed them more and more out in the wild. Would it be accurate that, in that time frame of the last 10, 15 years, there's been more wild turkeys around Wisconsin?
Yeah, certainly in the more northerly reaches of the state. I mean, we started turkey restoration efforts in a serious way in the 70s down in the Driftless area in southwestern Wisconsin. And then over time, we were trapping birds from those populations, releasing them elsewhere. We weren't, the DNR was, with our support. But then the populations would expand and we'd keep moving them and keep moving them. And by, I think the last reported release was in about mid-2000s. And by then we had turkeys in all available habitat around the state and in places we never honestly felt they could even survive. And they just keep thriving. Populations keep expanding, especially in the North Woods. In the original release zone, they've actually overshot their carrying capacity a little bit and are settling back down to the new normal of what the land can sustain. But certainly, yeah, there's been an expansion of turkeys in the last 10 to 15 years, but realistically, they've only been around for a little over 40. I often ask people when I'm giving talks, I say, how many of you were born after 1974? And you put hands in the air and they'll say, you people have never known Wisconsin without wild turkeys, but us older people can remember the very first time we heard a gobble or the very first time we saw a bird in the field.
What led to the turkey being eliminated in Wisconsin at that time?
Well, they were eliminated early in the settlement period. So the last wild turkey was killed near Darlington in 1881. So the early settlers with unrestricted market hunting and subsistence hunting just hunted them into extinction in the state. There were several efforts to restore them through the years, but they all failed because they were using pen-raised, semi-domesticated turkeys and then just taking them and letting them go, and they just couldn't survive in the wild. And it wasn't until the 70s when we started trading ruffed grouse for real wild turkeys from the Ozark Mountains in Missouri that, and we started letting them go, that those wild birds could sustain themselves and breed. So the basis of our population was all on grabbing existing wild birds with nets and letting them go in Wisconsin.
What allowed them to kind of prosper?
Well, in large part because we were using wild birds instead of pen-raised birds that had an inherent wildness to them and a fear of humans, but also the fact that we had hunting regulations in place, so people couldn't just, go out and shoot them every time they saw them like they did in the early settlement days. And lastly, the habitat has changed. When you look at pre-settlement Wisconsin, it was pretty much open prairie from the southwest up until you hit the tension zone, which kind of ran diagonally from, say, Green Bay up to the northwest. And then the north was an unbroken forest broken up by the occasional wildfire. There's no way turkeys could live up there. And they were found mostly in that southern prairie zone. And by the time we brought them back, all of a sudden we've opened up the northern forest. We've got agriculture all the way up to Lake Superior, and even the hardcore prairie areas that were burning all the time historically now have a lot of forests in them. Driftless area has a lot of oak forest. So our state right now is really largely great turkey habitat. It's a matter of bringing the birds in, and they had this empty niche to fill, and they just took off and filled it.
And you mentioned earlier that they've thrived in certain areas where they were never thought they would kind of thrive. But what are some of those areas, and why has that occurred?
Well, when we started turkey restoration, we thought wild turkeys needed wilderness, and deep, dark forests, because that's the only place they were found, in the 50s and 60s. But the only reason they were there was because that's where they weren't being persecuted by people. We found out since the restoration phase, when we did a lot of research on their population dynamics and habitat use, that they thrive and do best in a landscape that's about 50-50 forested and open. They're technically a forest bird, but they need open landscapes to raise their young. So, we really thought that they wouldn't thrive in the northern forest just because it was so heavily forested. And then also, here's a bird with a bald head, not real dense feathers, not really suited for winter conditions, deep snow. They feed mostly on things on the ground. So we kind of had this idea that once they got up so far north, they just weren't going to make it because it was going to be too cold, too snowy, not enough food, not enough agriculture for them to go picking through waste grain. And yet, in the northern woods, they're doing pretty good. Now, their populations certainly aren't as dense as they are in the ag area, but, you can hunt them in Douglas County. You can hunt them in Ashland County. They're there.
What were some of the challenges along the way? Were there political battles that needed to be won, whether it was political or working with hunters or just making them latch on in certain areas of the state? What was kind of the course of the restoration effort over the course of those decades?
At that time, there wasn't much of a political battle. People were very accepting of bringing in a new game animal to hunt. There weren't big discussions about the ecological appropriateness of it or anything like that. It was really, how can we make this happen, and figuring out what the birds needed, and finding the money to do the trap and transfer efforts. A big part of why NWTF formed its earliest chapters and what those chapters did with the money, everything we raised, we pretty much gave to the DNR to help fund the trap and transfer effort so that birds could be brought in or moved around in the landscape. Originally, we were trading 10 rough grouse for every turkey with Missouri because they were trying to restore rough grouse populations. Over time, we found that was untenable, and it wasn't really working because Missouri didn't have super good rough grouse habitat. So then we acted as the intermediary where we could use money to reimburse a state for giving us birds. I don't know what the rate was at that time. I think we're currently doing $500 a bird. There's still some moving around going on. And so, we'd raise money, we'd put it in this account, we'd reimburse Missouri or whomever we got birds from to the tune of, like I say now, to be about 500. I don't know what it was in the early days. And that money gets used by that agency to go back into their management and land acquisition. So that was one of the big challenges. But as far as, there were no legislative challenges that I recall. Everybody was really behind this.
And how long did it take before you had a sustainable population where you could actually kind of open it up to hunting and you felt confident that they were going to thrive long-term in the state?
Well, the earliest releases were in 1976. First release site was in Vernon County in the Bad Axe River basin there. And then we were able to start hunting in that area by 83. So the first hunts were in 1983. There were only 4 open zones at that time, but that was only 7 years after the first releases. So they were taken off pretty significantly. statewide, we were hunting by 2006. So as we were trapping and moving them around, we opened up the final zones in '06.
So this has really been a long-term success story. Have you learned lessons from this reintroduction of a species that conservationists can apply to other restorations and other areas, whether it's turkeys or other species?
Yeah, it is really one of the greatest conservation success stories that we can think of in the U.S., where we essentially had zero wild turkeys prior to 1976 in Wisconsin, and we had them in every available habitat statewide within about 40 years. It's pretty much unheard of. As far as applying it to other species, having good popular support is important, but the reality here is that we have a species that's pretty prolific, that's pretty generalist in nature when it comes to its habitat selection. It's not a specialist that just needs something specific. So once they were put out and properly managed, they could bloom and expand. The only thing that's kind of going on right now that's of an equivalent is the reintroduction of elk into Wisconsin. And even that, we're seeing challenges because these elk aren't really moving around. Or at least the population up around Clam Lake, and they just pretty much stay right where you put them. They aren't suddenly turning up and starting core breeding populations elsewhere. So I think it's pretty species specific that turkeys were the right bird in the right habitat at the right time.
I know there's a number of variety of wild turkeys. Could you maybe talk a little bit about some of the different varieties of them that are found around the United States and how maybe the ones that are found in Wisconsin differ?
Sure. So there's 4 subspecies found in the United States. There's 5 actual subspecies. So you've got the Osceolas, which live in the panhandle of Florida. They're very distinctive. They're kind of taller, darker, thinner, long-legged, some of the characteristics you see. And then the Eastern, which is the largest and the most numerous, the most widespread, are the ones we find in Wisconsin, Eastern subspecies. And then when you get out into, say, the lodgepole pines of the west, you've got Merriams. So in the Black Hills and through most of the Rockies are the Merriam subspecies. And Rio Grandes are found in Texas, Oklahoma, the southwestern United States. And then the Gould's subspecies is found mostly in Mexico. They're just getting up into New Mexico and Arizona. So there's 5 different subspecies, and they're mainly distinguished by plumage, but also by the habitats that they thrive in. We see that the Merriams like big wide open spaces more. They're very mobile. They move longer distances. They have very bright white tail tip, really distinctive looking birds. But other than that, it's the same call. It's the same general habitat characteristics. And the Rio Grandes are more coppery green colored in the body, more of a buffy tips to their tail feathers. And they seem to like that scrubby habitat, more deserty. And then the Goulds are definitely a cactusy, deserty species. So yeah, Wisconsin, we have the Easterns throughout the state. There's no other type found in the state, and they are the biggest.
So are the ones that are in Wisconsin now kind of the same variety that were in Wisconsin before they were kind of eliminated there? Or is it a different variety now?
No, it's the same variety. It's just that their range had contracted to where, they were spread out throughout the east, but then they contracted into, say, the Ozark Mountains and other semi-wilderness areas where they could escape people. But it's the same subspecies.
So I live in Madison, Wisconsin, and I was talking to a friend about turkeys the other day, and one of the things she wants to know specifically about turkeys is, for a while there was this group of turkeys. I don't know if you know about this or not, but there was this group of turkeys that was living in a neighborhood in Madison. They were called the Atwood Avenue turkeys, and they kind of just lived. They had a Facebook page and caretakers watching over in the traffic areas, and I was just kind of wondering if you've seen that elsewhere turkeys like kind of being urbanized in some sense. Is that relatively common? I mean, Madison's kind of wide open, and there are green spaces in between neighborhoods and such, which is probably why they were in that area. But have you seen them kind of be urbanized in other areas as well?
Yeah, most certainly. Unfortunately, they are very adaptable, and they know where they're not being hunted and pursued, and they can thrive and survive around people pretty well. I know there's also quite a few of them in the Arboretum in Madison.
Yes.
And I grew up in the Madison area, actually, in McFarland, so I'm very familiar with the Atwood neighborhood there. And yeah, we have the same reports in the Twin Cities and most major metropolitan areas. And it's kind of neat because here's a bird that's moving about during the day. They're big, they're vocal, they're very visible, and people can enjoy them and enjoy watching them and seeing them. And there comes a time where they create some problems for people. I mean, you can just go on YouTube and Google turkeys chasing, and you'll find all these videos of turkeys chasing a dog or chasing the mailman or strutting out in the middle of the street. And during breeding season, the toms can get aggressive and puff up and chase people around, but realistically, they don't do any harm. If they wanted to, they could spur you and scratch you, but most of the time, if you stand up to them, they just leave. Yeah, they can be a nuisance, so they can roost on people's roofs, and they can leave some droppings around and things like that. But for the most part, they can live and coexist with people pretty well.
So these turkeys on Atwood Avenue, they were there for like a whole year. They when they were young, they were like 4 toms and like 4 females, and they kind of like just roamed the neighborhood for like an entire year. And then they kind of abruptly kind of disappeared and went somewhere else. Is that like an unusual thing that a number of turkeys would inhabitate an area for a year and then kind of just leave and go somewhere else?
Yeah, they might have just found that it wasn't the best place to live. What turkeys need in their annual life cycle, they've got to have, like all animals, food, water, cover, and space. And the space thing kind of comes into, you got to have nesting areas, and you've got to have places to display and places to roost. And if it doesn't all come together, they will move on. We have seen turkeys do pretty big movements from one seasonal range to another, or just to move across the landscape, which really helped in the restoration phase, where when you put them out there, they didn't just stay put, they started wandering around. So these birds might have just started wandering around and found a little more suitable habitat somewhere else.
I want to talk to you about hunting a little bit, but I also want to talk to you just as a non-hunter and like somebody who just likes to see wildlife. Is there any like tips or great, if somebody wants to go out in nature and just kind of like watch the bird and like see the plumage and kind of the like mating displays that they put on, is there any like tips that you would give people who want to kind of just see them recreationally, like maybe where, or just like generally like how to go out and see that?
The easiest way to do it is that wild turkeys, from the time they can fly, they will roost in a tree every night. They fly up into a tree at dark or right at dusk and find a spot to spend the night, and will stay there all night long, fly down first light in the morning. And this protects them from predators and whatnot. So if you wanted to see them, it's good to kind of see where they are in the afternoons, and they're going to be roosting somewhere near there. Get out early the next morning. Get out in the dark, and they will gobble. The toms will gobble on that roost as dawn is breaking, and you'll hear those gobbles. And you can move closer and closer until you can see them up in the trees, and just kind of wait there. And if you're in an open area near those trees, they'll often fly down in that open area and then assemble and start moving around, going about their daily business. And this works best like from March, April, May, which also coincides with the hunting seasons, but they'll do it any time of the year. So if you get out there and in the early morning hours and listen for those gobbles, and sometimes you can actually incite the gobble. You can use a turkey call, and they will respond to it. But you can crow like a crow calls, or sometimes just any loud noise. Sometimes just slamming a door will make them gobble on the roost because they'll shock gobble, or calling like an owl in the dark will make them respond with a gobble. So that's the best way to find them, locate them, and then get in a position where you can see them. And certainly during that breeding season, that's where you're going to see the toms out in the open fields, and they're all puffed up, and they got their tail fanned out, and they're trying to attract a mate. That's when you're going to see those real courtship displays.
And I know it's a pretty big deal. Hunting turkeys is a pretty big deal across the United States, but in Wisconsin, I'm just wondering what kind of economic value has it generated for the state and in the Midwest area after the reintroduction of them in Wisconsin?
Well, the fact that most of the state of Wisconsin is pretty ideal turkey habitat means that we've got a pretty strong population, and we've got fairly liberal hunting regulations in that you can take multiple birds and just get another permit. So there's a limit on the number of permits that are issued. We don't want to overhunt the population. It's a sustainable harvest. But Wisconsin has the fourth highest turkey harvest in the nation, behind only Pennsylvania, Missouri, and Alabama. So there's a lot of opportunity for hunting, and it does generate a huge amount of economic input for the state. I believe that turkey hunting license sales are second only to deer license sales as far as the amount of income generated for the Department of Natural Resources. And then you take that economic input and expand it out for every license sold. There's all this other stuff that goes along with people going turkey hunting. So it's the ammunition, it's the clothing, the calls. Turkey hunting is kind of a gear sport, so you've got a lot of stuff you need to buy to, it doesn't have to be. It's simple for someone new to get into, but once you get into it, you're like, oh, I've got to get another call, or I've got to get the latest and greatest gizmo and gadget. And so it has a huge economic impact. And then when you have non-residents coming in or residents moving about, they're buying gasoline and food and lodging while they're in their pursuit of turkeys. So it's a multi-million-dollar economic impact.
What is your organization's role in, managing the population or, promoting the activity of hunting of turkeys? And what role does your organization seek out in having in Wisconsin and also just across the country?
So the state wildlife agencies actually manage wildlife populations. It's their constitutional purview to do so. So we don't manage the population, the DNR does. However, Wisconsin DNR is very good to work with. They're great partners, and we're very happy to partner with them in determining some of the hunting season framework, like how many tags are issued, what the seasons are going to be, and things like that. We have a seat on the Wild Turkey Advisory Committee, which is a group of, there's 20 of us involved from various entities, from tribal representation to conservation organizations around the state, and the DNR and other natural resource agencies like the Forest Service all sit on this advisory council or committee, and we review potential changes and regulations in the season framework and make recommendations back to the DNR. So that's our role there. We also, when you buy a turkey license, you also buy a turkey stamp, and that generates some dedicated funding that goes back into wild turkey management. And as part of the advisory committee, we help determine how that money should be best spent to benefit the wild turkey in the state.
And do you enjoy turkey hunting yourself?
Of course. It'd be crazy if I didn't. Actually, I come to Wisconsin. I usually buy at least 2 tags down there, and then I hunt Minnesota as well. Lately, I've hunted Kansas. I've also been to Texas and Nebraska and other places. So one of the things about turkey hunters, we just like to, well, for one thing, is with the 5 subspecies, it's a big thing to go out and try and get one of each of the subspecies, so that gets you moving around in the landscape. But we just like to see different country and hunt different birds and take full advantage of that spring season, move around.
I'm kind of curious. I assume you eat a lot of these birds that you're hunting. Do they taste differently? The ones in the different species, do they have like a different taste to them? Or is there like a different? Is it a different meal for each species?
I've never noticed that. I've taken Miriam's, Rios, and Easterns and not noticed a difference at all in the flavor of the meat. Obviously, wild turkeys are not your typical butterball turkey, so it's not that really white meat. It's more of a pheasant-like white meat. Not gamey at all. I won't even say that. It's more flavorful. It's more textured. But to me, it's wonderful meat. And then the legs tend to be dark meat. And so I take legs and thighs, which have a lot of sinew in them from, these birds walk most of the time. And I'll often take the legs and thighs and put them in a crock pot until they break down a little bit and then shred them, and you can separate the bones and sinew from the meat and make soup or something like that with that. But the turkey breast is fantastic, and you can think of a million different ways to cook turkey breast.
So if I came to Thanksgiving at your house, there would probably be a wild turkey on the table?
No, it's usually gone by then. You hunt in the spring and you eat them all summer. There's usually nothing left by November. But, what we're finding, and going back to a little bit about NWTF's role in turkey management and whatnot and promoting turkeys, a big part of what we do is try and recruit more hunters into hunting. We're seeing a trend in the United States where people are stopping hunting when they, the baby boomers, for example, and they're in their 70s and whatnot, they're kind of getting out of hunting. And so the number of hunters across the board is declining, and we're looking at a real cliff as the baby boomers get out of hunting. We're not seeing a lot of millennials and younger people getting into the sport. And some people would say, well, what's a big deal with that? That means more game for me. The reality is most of conservation of all species is funded by hunters through their license sales and excise taxes on firearms, ammunition, and sporting equipment. And so that's for all species. It's not like our license dollars only go to manage for game. It's supporting the Wildlife Agency so that they can go out and manage all habitats for all species and benefit all species. So if we see this big decline in hunters, we have a real problem. And then we're going to see state agencies in fiscal crises where they're going to have to make hard decisions on what they can manage. We want them to manage all habitats for all species. So we're heavily engaged in what we call R3. It's hunter recruitment, retention, and reactivation. We want to recruit new hunters. We want the existing hunters to keep hunting. And we want to reactivate people that have dropped out of hunting. Turkey hunting just so happens to be relatively easy. The hard part is being camouflaged, being still, and mastering the art of calling turkeys. They will respond to a call very readily. But the actual time to pull the trigger and to harvest that bird is fairly simple. You get them in range, they're standing there. It's not like wing shooting a pheasant, trying to shoot a bird out of the air. It's pretty much a stationary target. So it's a great introductory hunt for someone wanting to get into hunting. And then you talk about the food value. Here you've got a 20-pound bird. Most of it's edible. It's very good food. And as we see more and more people wanting to know where their food comes from, wanting to know that an animal wasn't raised just to slaughter, but actually lived, its life out, its whole life expectancy out, and then was harvested sustainably and humanely. And then you processed it, and you packaged it, and you cooked it, so you know it's healthy. There's nothing more organic than wild, harvested wildlife. So these are things we're looking at that, how can we work together to try and recruit people? And we did recently just hire a new hunter recruitment, retention, and reactivation coordinator in Wisconsin who's going to work closely with other partners and with the state agency to try and pass this message along. And anybody that's interested in taking up the sport of hunting can contact the NWTF and we'll help you get out.
When you were talking about like getting younger people or millennial era people into the idea of hunting, the like locally sourced aspect, is that something you're finding, like kind of connecting millennials in that way?
Very much so, very much so. DNR has a program called Learning to Hunt for Food that is definitely geared towards millennials. And, we are trying to take these people like me, or older traditional hunters and say, don't try and recruit somebody that looks like you. Find somebody, here's a guy with tattoos and an earring and whatever. Doesn't matter. He's interested in learning how to hunt, and he or she, I should say, and maybe isn't your traditional person that you would expect to see in the field, and that's great. That's wonderful. Those are the type of people that we want to connect with, and we want to take them out and show them, again, sustainable, it's healthy, and it's also a way of life, and it's a healthy way of life. It gets you out of doors at a time of day where you may not necessarily do that, and you see the most amazing things while you're out in the field. And I often say, people have asked, why do I hunt? I'm like, I'm telling you, I have seen the most amazing things that I would not see if it weren't for my dog, my gun, that animal that I'm pursuing. And, taking the animal at the end, it's icing on the cake, but it's not necessary part of enjoying hunting.
Well, I think you have to share one of those stories. And what was one of the highlights that you've, being out hunting that you've seen that that you wouldn't have otherwise seen?
Well, besides being an avid turkey hunter, I hunt a lot of things in different seasons, and was out in western North Dakota. I have an English pointer bird dog, and my partner and I go out and camp on the prairie in western North Dakota and hunt sharp-tailed grouse and Hungarian partridges. So we set up a tent, small lake, and there's not an electric light within 6 miles of where we're camping. And at night, you see the Milky Way in a way that you don't see it when you're in an urban setting. There's no light pollution at all. And we had, the one night, I had 6 different groups of coyotes coming through just outside the tent, yipping and squalling and waking us up, and you'd sit there at night and just watch the satellites and whatnot. And then, walking on the prairie, we often, we're hunting typically native prairie habitats and walking 10, 12 miles a day. And you see all sorts of stuff. I mean, you see rattlesnakes, you see badgers, you see pronghorn antelope, we had one case where an antelope must have thought the dog was another antelope and started kind of going after the dog until it got close enough to realize it wasn't. So, yeah, it's all manner of different things that you see.
So how do you convince people to get involved, and what's kind of the starting point for somebody who is interested in hunting that doesn't maybe has any background in it?
I mentioned we have an R3 coordinator. His name's John Motovilov. And, someone can contact me and I can put you in touch with John. But also on the Department of Natural Resources website, if you just go on there and Google Learn to Hunt, you'll find a whole page. There's a whole program called Learn to Hunt Wild Turkeys, and there are sessions held in just about every community across the state. And volunteers will take you through the process, teach you about the biology and ecology of the bird and the how-tos and the gear and all that stuff. And it culminates with a turkey hunt. If you're an adult and you want to get into the Learn to Hunt for Food program, that's another program, and I know it's very active in the Madison area. So you can sign up for that and go out with other adults. And then, part of the process is learning, because there is an application system, and it can be somewhat daunting when you've got regulations and you've got to get the right permit, and you've got to know the turkey permit area, the hunting zone that you can hunt in, and what season it is. So they'll help you navigate that process. I think one other good resource, I want to put in a plug for it because that was a part of it, is the Department of Natural Resources, through the Wild Turkey Advisory Committee a couple of years ago, we crafted a new management plan for turkeys in the state called The Ecology of Wild Turkeys in Wisconsin, a plan for their management 2015 to 2025. It's available at most DNR service centers in hard copy. You can also download the electronic version from the DNR's website. And it's got a lot about wild turkey ecology and management, where they live, what their seasonal needs are, and then that history of the restoration and how we got where we are, and then plans for the future and future management. It is a wealth of knowledge, and I highly recommend that anybody interested in turkeys get a copy of that.
What is the future vision, looking 10 years out?
We are at the point now where turkeys are in all their available habitat, and their population is actually leveled out. This is a very common occurrence with a new species in a new habitat. They will climb and grow and expand until they actually overshoot the carrying capacity of the land, and then they settle back because of density-dependent factors. They'll settle into this long-term norm. So it's our feeling that the population peaked out about 5, 6, maybe 7 years ago, and has settled into this new normal. It's still expanding in the north, but in a large sense, it's in a stable condition. We want to keep it where it is. We want to maintain, current harvest levels, current levels of opportunity for people to go out and pursue them. And we as an organization are dedicated to creating more habitat, creating more hunters, and creating more places for people to go hunting. One of the things we often hear from people is, I don't know where to go. And so we're always helping purchase more lands or open up existing public lands for hunting. And I think the future is to maintain our population, maintain its health, maintain its balance with the current environment, and maintain hunting opportunities.
What's the favorite part of your job for you?
I think it's people. I get to work with a lot of volunteers. Wisconsin, we're number 4th in the number of volunteers and NWTF members that we have. And they're all dedicated, passionate people that love the same things that I love. And, invariably it's hard to get back around to business because we're telling stories and, everybody's almost instantly a friend. You've got common ground to talk with them quite a bit. So that is a big part of the job, in working with wildlife professionals, working with legislators, and just traveling around.
Thanks to Rick for the knowledge. As a non-hunter, there's a lot that I don't know about wild turkeys, and he taught me a lot. If you'd like to learn more about some of the things that we talked about during the interview, make sure to go to the website wispod.com for links. I'll post a pretty entertaining video about the Atwood Avenue wild turkeys on the site as well. Don't forget to subscribe to the Wisconsin Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. You can also stay in the loop about the pod by visiting the website, as I mentioned, and following the show on Twitter @WisPodcast and on Facebook @the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.